One subject that's fascinated me for a long time is the subject of free will, especially because all different kinds of people seem to have denied its existence throughout history. Welcome to the Council of Trent podcast. I'm your host, Catholic Answers apologist and speaker, Trent Horn. And today I want to share with you an interview that I did with Cy Kellett on the Catholic Answers Focus podcast. This is kind of a part one of a two-part interview, but both interviews kind of stand on their own. In the first episode I did with Cy, I talked about how atheists often deny the existence of free will. And what they will do is they'll appeal to findings in neuroscience. They'll say, look, you and I are just brains. We are matter in motion, and our brain decides what we do. Hence the title of this episode, Did My Brain Make Me Sin? Part 2, which I'll air next week, is from Christians who deny the existence of free will and say, well, it's not our brain that makes us do what we do. It's God, because he's in charge of everything and he causes everything. So that'll be part 2 next week. But for this week, I want to talk about secular advocates of the denial of free will, people like Sam Harris or Daniel Dennett, though they deny free will in different ways, as you'll see in this interview. So I hope you like it, and be sure to check out the Catholic Answers Focus podcast. They have a lot of great interviews there. But without further ado, here's my interview with Cy Kellett on atheistic objections to free will, or did my brain make me sin?
Atheists, they keep picking on my free will. And I have to make a conscious choice to be charitable so that I feel proves that I have free will. But what's up with atheists hating free will so much?
Well, I don't know if atheists would hate free will.
All right, but
many of them, I'd say almost all of them, but along with even other people as well in the modern age, seem to have serious objections to or outright denials of free will.
Yeah.
And it's funny because if you throw out free will, it's like, you and I can't criticize each other. If I make fun of your book, you make fun of my books. Everything has to be the way it is.
It's just math. It's just math working its way
Chemistry
out.
and physics.
Yeah.
But this is a subject that people have thought about, philosophers have discussed for centuries, really since the beginning of philosophy. Do we have control over our lives? Do we have a freedom to choose, a freedom to will certain outcomes?
Yeah.
Or have our decisions been determined by something else? So in this case, I think many atheists are antagonistic towards free will, or many of them would say, well, I don't see how there could be any framework for free will, because they embrace naturalism. They embrace the view that the physical universe is all there is. Maybe there are some non-physical things that exist. Maybe minds exist. Maybe there's some non-physical things. Because there's some atheists who are just straight up materialists.
Right.
And they're going to be pretty opposed to free will. Because a materialist would say, look, all that exists are atoms, electrons, physical things. They are governed by the laws of nature, governed by physical laws. And so it's like a great big clockwork. And the makeup of the universe, its physical makeup, determines what events will happen in the future. And so from there, they would say, okay, if everything's just material, then you and I can't will it to be any different, just like the snowball rolling down the mountain cannot will the avalanche. It could cause the avalanche to act in different ways,
Right.
but it can't will it. So this idea goes back a long ways. You go to the first century Roman philosopher Cicero, the statesman and philosopher Cicero. This is what he writes. He says, besides, since everything happens by fate, as will be shown elsewhere, if there could be any mortal who could observe with his mind the interconnection of all causes, nothing indeed would escape him. For he who knows the causes of things that are to be necessarily knows all the things that are going to be. And then Cicero goes on to say only God could know this. So human beings, we just have to resign ourselves to this fact and resign ourselves to the idea that the passage of time is like the unwinding of a rope, producing nothing new, but unfolding what was there at first.
So that first of all, Cicero, I mean, this is wonderful stuff from him. And he's not, even say a Catholic such as ourselves would not say he's entirely wrong about this. That you might even say, I don't know what if there's any extraterrestrial intelligent life. I have no idea. But let's say there's not. Well, then what Cicero said is true virtually everywhere in the universe. It's just here that it's not true.
Right. So it is the case that, and this idea about determinism gained a lot of steam in the Enlightenment when you had the discoveries of people like Isaac Newton, for example.
Yeah.
And laws of motion, laws of thermodynamics, seeing that the world is governed by these laws of nature and these relationships between matter and energy. And the idea is that, okay, we can now, as science progresses, we can create, this is something that people had an understanding of for a long time. But then when you have these scientific equations, so that when you create a cannon or a projectile,
Right.
and if if Chris Check, president of Catholic Answers, when he was in the Marines doing artillery, you have little field manuals with formulas.
Right.
And if you just aim everything just right, you can know exactly where the bomb is going to go off when you factor in wind, temperature, angle, aim. So you just start to extrapolate from that to say, well, if we know where every atom in the universe is, then we'll know everything that will happen. And you're right, in many cases for inanimate objects, we can predict these things, at least for what are called Newtonian or macroscopic objects, things that are big. Because the problem is people are like, oh yeah, like you go to Pierre Simon Laplace in the 18th century.
Yeah.
And he talks about this, that he describes the universe as being like, almost like clockwork.
Right.
This giant erector set, and you could predict everything. But then scientists hit a snag with that in the late 19th and early 20th centuries with the rise of quantum theory.
Oh, okay.
Because the problem is with quantum physics, it's like, oh, we have the particle that decays from the atom. We can't predict that. Even if we know everything about the atoms and the electrons, we can't predict what particular, we can't predict what state they're going to be
Even
in.
physical processes, then, you wouldn't say what Cicero said about them, that if I knew every detail of the current state of things, I would know what's going to happen in a minute, and then I could know in 100 years. Or
That's what scientists thought with the rise of Newton.
But you can't do that.
At least they would say you couldn't universally know that when it comes to quantum events, because there's a particular kind of randomness, or the causes in quantum events are probabilistic more than classical. So you take, objects like, my book. If I drop it, it's always going to be the case. It's going to fall. It's going to accelerate. We can predict its speed. We can do that with these large size objects, and it always happens unless another force intervenes. But what I would say with the quantum world is that the cause and effect there is more probabilistic. It's like, oh, well, there is a cause, but it doesn't always manifest itself 100% of the time. That the nucleus causes the electron or the proton to decay, to be emitted, but maybe 80% of the time.
Yeah.
So it's not, you don't have that. But even still, atheists will say, okay, quantum world, we'll set that aside. That's weird and odd.
We'll get to that when we understand it better, probably.
Right. But when it comes to human beings, even if there are quantum processes in our brain that result in our behaviors, we can't control them.
I see. So that's a pretty good argument.
So the problem is some people may think, oh, well, I can deal with these objections, the Newtonian determinism that, oh, the whole universe is in a little erector set and I can figure it out because, hey, we got quantum mechanics. That doesn't really help free will because quantum mechanics is random. And we believe that our wills are very intentional, that we, as a subject or an agent, we choose to do certain things. So now modern philosophy, you look at it for thousands of years, and the question about free will and determinism relates to these big subjects. So what does it mean to have free will is one.
That's right.
And number two would be, is free will compatible with determinism? So determinism would be the idea that what happens now is caused or determined by previous states. So the previous, you trace it all the way back to the Big Bang. Everything that happens now is just because of physical causes in the past.
Yes.
So that would be determinism. And so the debate is not really between people, some people will think, Cy, oh, do we have free will or do we not? Like, is that the debate? We have free will or we don't have free will?
Yeah, I have to say that's the intuitive position, but it may be subtler than that.
It's a bit subtler than that. Rather, the debate is whether determinism is compatible with free will.
Okay.
So here's the thing. So let's say, there's two camps here. There would be those who would say they are not compatible. And so if the world is determined, you don't have free will.
Yes.
If we are, and especially if we would say, and then let's shrink the world to human beings. if my actions are all determined by things outside of me, if the reason I'm doing everything I'm doing right now is only because of events that happened going back to the Big Bang, we would say I'm determined. So then the question is, can I be free if I am determined? If you say no...
You're a determinist.
No, if you say no, you're an incompatibilist.
Oh, gotcha.
You would say, if I am determined, I am not free. And I bet that's a position you would have. If the reason I do things is only because of physical causes outside of me, I'm determined. And if that's the case, I would agree. I would say I'm not free.
Okay.
Especially if you add this caveat, I could not have done otherwise.
Gotcha. Okay, so I would, one excludes the other. Those are incompatible.
Right. So then there's two branches of incompatibilism.
Okay.
So we see determinism. You can't have determinism and free will if you're an incompatibilist. You have to get rid of one or the other.
Okay.
So if you believe you have free will, you're called a libertarian, but it's not political libertarian.
Right.
In philosophy,
but you're at liberty to do what you want.
You have liberty, you have freedom, you can choose. So an incompatibilist who believes in free will is going to jettison determinism. They're going to say, no. Human beings are not determined solely by physical causes outside of them. Other libertarians will say not only that, but we could have done otherwise. I could have decided to be a little bit late and go to the bathroom before this. Right. I'm okay. I don't need to go to the bathroom. I'm just saying I could have done other things. I could have acted otherwise.
Right.
That's the libertarians. The hard determinists, this would be somebody like Sam Harris in his book Free Will.
Right.
He would say, you're right. Free will and determinism are not compatible. Get rid of free will.
Yeah, you don't have it.
He would say free will is an illusion. We don't have free will. You are no more free than a lightning bolt or a tiger that leaps after its prey. And
I would say to him, I don't choose to believe that. And he would say, no, you don't.
You don't choose to believe it. You don't
choose to not believe it.
And and to say, well, no, we are determined and we don't have free will has wide-ranging consequences. The biggest one being related to moral responsibility.
Yeah.
Because it seems pretty intuitive that if you are determined and you don't have free will, how could you be morally responsible for your actions?
Yeah, right.
Or that our responsibility for actions would have to be on par with take a lightning bolt. So, a lightning bolt is... So what Harris ends up having to argue in his book on free will is we are responsible for our acts, but only in a causal sense. So I would ask you this. If a cabin burns down because it was struck by lightning, is the lightning bolt responsible for the cabin burning down?
Oh, I see. So certainly in a moral sense, it is not because it has no moral capacity.
Right.
But in a physical sense, yes.
In a physical sense, yes.
Right.
So he would say, look, he would argue we could still have prisons and punishment for people who do bad things. He would say, look, he would say this, we would lock up lightning bolts and earthquakes if we could. So he would justify, normally punishment is related to moral responsibility. We punish people because they've done wrong.
Yeah.
But Harris would say, well, maybe not. Maybe we could just punish people for the good of society.
That doesn't seem right. Well, yeah, but would he say we could choose to do that, or would he would say
he would say we are just following? If we decide to do it,
like why write a book about this if you can't choose to do it?
Because he wanted to, and he did, and he had to.
Oh, I guess so. So all of this is determined. Like you don't have two choices as a society,
right?
Like not having choice. It makes it like, why are you trying to convince me of anything? Because either I am going to be convinced and that was predetermined, or I'm not going to be convinced and that was predetermined. So why are you trying to convince me of anything?
I would say that the denial of free will does lead to a kind of nihilism. In fact, scientists have shown in studies that when people read articles saying that they don't have free will, they're more likely to cheat at games and studies.
Oh, yeah.
There was one actually where the participants in a study read an article saying they don't have free will. And in the next exercise where they're giving spicy food to people who can't handle spicy food, they give them more of it.
Oh, that's
There's even a researcher in Israel who has said, look, we don't have free will, but we can't let people find out they don't have free will.
But if we don't have free will, it doesn't matter if they find out.
Right.
And you can't stop it anyways. You have no choice.
Right. So that would be this is the incompatibilist. Now, they're actually in the minority side.
Yeah, you can see why.
Which would be, well, on both sides. So you and I are incompatibilists because we think if you're determined, you're not free. So guess what? You're not determined. We're incompatibilists for libertarian freedom. Harris would be someone who'd say, right, if you're determined, you're not free, so you're not free. The majority of philosophers embrace a view called compatibilism.
Okay.
And what they'll say is, no, you can be free if you're determined, because being free only means you do what you want to do. Like if I dragged you into the kitchen to drink coffee and you're like, I hate coffee, I don't want to do this, you're not free. But if you go in the kitchen and drink the coffee and you like it and you wanted to do it, the compatibilist would say that you're free because you do what you want to do. And so at first, like, oh, that sounds like a nice way to tie up the bow. But incompatibilists, and this is where I and Sam Harris would agree, ironically enough. Even though he's an atheist, I would say both of us would say that's not free will. We would say no. And so Harris has an interesting analogy he makes. So Sam Harris is one of the new atheists, the four horsemen,
Yeah.
One of the other, so Daniel Dennett is kind of the forgotten fourth horseman. You got Dawkins, Hitchens, Harris, and Dennett.
Yeah.
Dennett's like, remember me?
Dennett's a terrible writer. That's why.
Yeah, he's a philosopher. He's not Hitchens.
No, they're supposed to be bad writers. Yeah.
So Dennett is a compatibilist, and he would say, well, look, what people talk about free will, they just mean the freedom to do what I want to do, the freedom from coercion. Harris says, look, I'm saying Atlantis doesn't... Harris uses this analogy. He says, I'm saying Atlantis, the underwater city where people live and Aquaman lives, doesn't exist. And Daniel Dennett would say, well, of course Atlantis exists. It's called Venice. It's about knee-high water, beautiful architecture. That's what you really mean by Atlantis. And of course Atlantis exists.
Yeah. That's a very Daniel Dennett move.
Right.
Yeah.
And so
you don't know what you're saying, but I, Daniel Dennett, know what you're saying.
Right. And so he would say with free will, well, no, I'm not saying it's free will in that you choose what to do and you could have done otherwise.
Yeah. It's free will in this other sense.
But most of us would say, okay, I'm free to do what I want, but could I have wanted anything else? Could I have, sometimes we have conflicting wants.
Yeah.
And we end up doing one of the wants beats the other one, but if it always would have beat the other one, am I really free? So that's why I am very open to the view that when it comes to free will, and actually some people who defend free will don't defend this principle, and that's called the principle of alternate possibilities. It's the idea that to be free, you have to have been able to act differently.
Yeah.
I could have chosen to do something else. And there's a thought experiment that tries to show that's not the case by, I think his name Harry Frankfurt is his name. He's a philosopher. It's published in 1969. And he said, imagine, Cy, you go into a voting booth, right? And you need to vote for the next president. One's nice and one's a dictator, okay? And we would think if you vote for the dictator, you're morally responsible because you could have voted for the good president.
Right.
Okay? There's two levers to pull. Imagine there is a man named Black, because in philosophical experiments, it's always Jones, Smith, and Mr. Black.
Okay.
So Mr. Black put a little thing in your brain so that if you voted for the good president, it would have rewired your brain so that you would have ended up voting for the dictator president instead.
Okay.
And so Black is waiting there, and you go in, and it turns out you voted for the dictator.
But are you responsible?
Well, here's the thing, because someone could say, even if I had voted for the good president, Black would have turned the thing in my brain and made me vote for the dictator anyways. And so we'd say, well, you are responsible, even if you couldn't have done otherwise, is Frankfurt's. So Frankfurt's trying to argue.
Oh, what a wonderful argument.
Right. So he's trying to say you can be responsible even if you could not have done otherwise.
Yeah.
But I'm not convinced by his thought experiment.
Well, it does. Okay, fair enough. But it has the elegance of this, that intention matters. That intention that you even in a situation where you might not be physically free to do something, what you're intending to do does matter.
That's correct. And the way to respond to this is actually what someone who defends Frankfurt, he calls this the flicker of freedom response. The idea is that maybe you couldn't have done, because imagine if Black, instead of messing up your brain, he just switched the wires in the voting machine.
Oh, yeah, sure.
So your vote went to the wrong person. We'd still say that you're not morally responsible because Black changed it, not you.
Yeah.
So even there, if he twists in your brain, Black still has to know your brain, and there's no way for him to know who you're going to freely choose until you choose it.
Yes.
So
right.
It doesn't disprove your free will. you still have that flicker of freedom. And so that shows you could have done otherwise. You're right. Even if somebody physically keeps you from doing the right thing, the fact that you intend and have willed it, even in a tiny sense, morally matters.
Right.
So you put it all together, that's the issues with free will there. Now, I will say most atheists are recently, in the past 40 years or so, have gotten on the bandwagon against free will, especially people like Harris, because they claim that neuroscience has disproven free will.
Yeah, this I find utterly unconvincing. But
many people do, though.
But they find it quite convincing, because there'll be a neuroscientific experiment that will say, for example, that there was some activity in your brain before you were conscious of making a decision. That seems utterly non-dispositive to me. Like, that tells you nothing about free will.
The experiment you're probably thinking of is the Benjamin Libet experiment, Libet. And this was done back in the 1980s and has been replicated often since then. What they'll do is they'll put electrodes on their head, and they'll have you watch a Libet clock. It's a clock that spins really fast. You can still see it. It just spins, I don't know, probably like 10 times faster than a regular clock. But you see it going, and you have the electrodes connected to you, and you're told, all right, do a random task like pushing a button or flexing your wrist. But don't plan to do it randomly. And then look at the clock, and when you have the intention to flex your wrist or push the button, look on the clock and say what number the hand was at. And then they put all that data together, and you're right. And what they show, they're measuring your brain waves with an electroencephalogram, and they'll show that there is something that they call a readiness potential. It was actually discovered 20 years before Libet by 2 German researchers, and it has a wonderful 16-letter German word, the Gaussian Definition,
which is the size of a conjunction in German.
Yeah, so, totally.
So yeah,
and so that ends up, that's called the readiness potential. And so what people will say is that before you consciously decide to flex your wrist or push the button, your brain was already. But here's what's interesting is people interpret the experiment. That experiment cannot disprove free will. People take the experiment and interpret its results. So one interpretation is your brain, during that electrical period before you are consciously aware of pushing the button, your brain has already decided when you're going to push the button or when you're going to flex your wrist. Your decision to do it is just you becoming aware of what your brain already did.
Okay.
That's one interpretation. But I, like you, would say I don't see that as a straightforward interpretation of what's going on at all.
No, it sounds like there's a process that happens that has various.
No, because there's other experiments like this that measure free will, dealing with and try to show even longer gaps. Says Libet only showed the readiness potential like 200 milliseconds. Like very, very short time period.
That is a brilliant experiment, though.
Oh,
to
yeah.
show that.
And they tried to show others. But it's all very artificial. Because when I talk about you and I having free will, we always talk about free will related to major decisions where we weigh reasons.
Yes.
And we choose to act. And sometimes we deliberate over them over a long period of time, where we say, okay, I have a big decision to make, option A and B, and I weigh the reasons for them. But in the Libet experiment and similar experiments like it, you're not weighing reasons. It's like, okay,
I see what you're saying.
You sit here, push the button. And then they say, don't plan to push the button like in 3 seconds. Do it when you feel like doing it. So it's like, why do you pick this moment instead of the next moment?
Yeah, it's irrelevant.
Well, more so than that, like if you went to the store, and like let's say you buy peanut butter, right? There's going to be different jars of peanut butter on the shelf. Right. Why did you pick one jar instead of the other?
Because it's chunky.
Well, let's say there's 10 chunkies.
Oh, why did I pick one? Oh, wait. I mean, I don't know. I don't know.
But that's right, you don't. So atheists and critics who say we don't have free will point out that, right, we make decisions, and many times we make them unconsciously.
Sure.
And it seems like our brain does that. But that's fine, because just because I don't make all of my decisions consciously with free will doesn't mean I don't make any of them with free will.
Yeah.
If I didn't let my unconscious be my autopilot during the day, I would go crazy.
Yeah.
Imagine if you had to think about every single thing you do. You'd go insane.
No, because I have an hour commute from home, and I go to sleep. In a certain sense, my brain goes to sleep from the time I leave here till the time I get home. I do the same thing every day. If I had to be conscious of every time I put the turn signal on, I would be a nut.
Right. So that's why it makes sense that our brain does this. And so even in the Libet experiment, this is what I think is happening. You've been instructed to do something randomly. How do you choose to do something randomly? What probably happens is that you let your unconscious give you an urge.
And then you go.
And then you go along with it, because what Libet showed, actually, Libet did not believe we lacked free will. He saw that with the readiness, he instructed some people to think about flexing their wrist and then not do it. And he showed that in the same case, the readiness potential in the brain scan goes up and then it flatlines. So Libet did not believe in, he didn't have anything about free will, but he said that we have free won't. That even if our brain tries to get us to do something, we've got like 100 milliseconds to veto the decision.
Oh, yes.
And that makes sense to me, that our subconscious can give us suggestions, and it's like a little, it based on our character and virtues, moves us in certain directions, and we with our conscious will can approve or reject them.
Yeah.
And that takes the load off our conscious will from having to come up with everything all the time. So people will bring up Libet and other experiments. A good book on this by Alfred Mele, or Mealy, M-E-L-E. It's called Free: Why Science Has Not Disproven Free Will. That's a good resource I'd recommend to our listeners. But yeah, when people bring up the neuroscience, I would say, look, at the you cannot get a sweeping claim that we don't have free will from an artificial experiment like this that's not, just because we all know our brain is involved in our decisions. Like the readiness potential, to me, it's just you're in a position where your brain knows you have to do something, so it makes sense it's warming the engine up to do something. Yeah. Not necessarily it's already decided what that is. But my advice for listeners, Cy, when the arguments for free will come up, this is my simple argument for free will. If we don't have free will, we don't have moral responsibility. We do have moral responsibility. Therefore, we have free will. Yeah. And so that would be to be against the compatibilists. In premise one would be against them, saying, no, you need both. And then against people like Harris, we do have moral responsibility. So go back to the punishment thing with Harris. He would say, well, we lock people up just to make society better, not because they deserve punishment.
Yeah.
Well, what if I said this? What if we could prove society would have less crime if we imprisoned the family members of a criminal with the criminal? They do this in some countries, in North Korea.
Oh, yeah, right.
Because think about it.
They got hardly any crime there in North Korea.
But think, what if the idea here is that the idea of imprisoning an innocent person for the crimes of a sibling or a parent is abhorrent to us. Not just because the objection is not, well, we don't know if that would really reduce crime. We would say that's unjust. You can't imprison someone for a crime they had nothing to do with.
It's monstrously unjust.
Even if it did make society a better place.
Right. You can't just do stuff because it makes society better.
Right. But the thing is, if we don't have free will, no one's morally responsible for anything. So for me, the arguments for moral responsibility and its necessary connection to free will, I think are very strong. Of course, there's a vast amount of literature on that we can't get into in this episode. But I think if people focus on that in the free will debate, that the people who want to say we don't have free will because of neuroscience, they believe Christians are morally responsible for all kinds of bad things.
Oh, yeah. Right.
And to tap into that deep-seated intuition, to me, it's a powerful one. And then to move us to say, well, if we are morally responsible, where does morality come from? And I think it ultimately is a good way to point ourselves back to the theistic foundations of reality.
But that's a good reason to deny free will, is that the implications that I might be a free creature are vast.
Yes.
And so I just eliminate that all those implications go away.
Right.
So there's a kind of strategy to it.
There is.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people do see that, and then if to be held that I'm morally responsible for my actions, it's a weighty thing. And then to understand, okay, well, what makes things right? What makes them wrong? Why have I been created? What have I been made for? These are important questions. But if we throw free will out the window, we don't have any hope of really trying to answer them.
No, but you can certainly understand why Sam Harris tries. But it seems to me that there's also a fault in the modern mind, and I want to ask you about this. That often, and you've alluded to it several times here, that there is science, and then there is the meaning of that science and its implications.
Absolutely.
And it often seems to me that what the casual science-minded person will get sucked into is the science says this electrical impulse goes off in your brain 200 milliseconds before whatever.
Before you are consciously aware of a decision you've made. That's another problem. There's a difference between me deciding something and me noticing I've decided it.
Yeah, that's all
There's
right.
a slight lag there.
But what I'm
they'll have the facts. They'll have these facts here.
Here's the thing. I think the position that we're in is to say I agree with all that science.
Right.
The science seems really solid. All of the implications that you drew from it make no sense.
That's right.
Or they're not necessary implications. And if they're not necessary implications, that means they're not scientific.
That's right. And so when it comes also to the idea of whether we have free will or not, for me, the burden of proof is on those who deny it, because it just seems obvious that we do.
Right.
That it would take, for me to give up belief in free will, it cannot just be the tentative interpretation of a scientific experiment. It would have to be evidence that is more powerful than my own perception of reality. Now, that evidence can be mustered. Like I perceive
the sun coming up and going down.
Yeah, sun up, sun down. I perceive it, but with all of this other evidence from astronomy about how the solar system works and how it better explains the motion of the sun, that overcomes an intuition. Or you might even have an intuition the Earth is flat. If you looked around and just think you're on a flat disk. I perceive that. But then there's other hypotheses that are better at explaining that, such as, well, if the sphere is large enough, parts of it will look flat to you.
Right.
But why does a ship disappear over the horizon if it's flat?
They get smaller as they go away.
Right? There's some.
I'm sorry, I'm playing around now.
I know we'll do a whole episode on flat Earth one day.
But right. So what you're saying though is
we can choose not to.
An intuition as overwhelming as my sense that I do get to choose at least about some things.
Right.
Would require not just some one experiment that shows there's this fraction of a second difference between this and that action of the brain. You would need overwhelming, and there is not overwhelming evidence.
No, there's not. I would say that, and it's not with free will. The two big arguments for it, for me, are going to be that is what we perceive, and it is the only thing that makes sense of moral responsibility, which is also something that seems to patently be obvious and exist. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching. Be sure to tune in next week to part 2, where I'll share with you my interview with Cy, where we talked about religious objections to free will and Christians who say that God causes everything that we do, and so we don't have free will. And in that sense, maybe it's God that causes us to sin. Could that be true? You'll find out about that next week. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you have a very blessed day. Hey, thanks for watching this video. If you want to help us produce more great content like this, be sure to click subscribe and go to TrentHornPodcast.com to become a premium subscriber. You'll help us create more videos like this and get access to bonus content and sneak peeks of our upcoming projects.